The silent betrayal that changed the course of ancient history. A go path. That is all it took. Not an army, not a fleet of 1,000 ships, not the wrath of a god, king seated on a throne of gold. A single, narrow, forgotten trail through the mountains, and one man willing to walk a stranger down it in exchange for silver. Somewhere above the cliffs of Thermopylae, in the cold hours before dawn, sandals crunch on loose stone. A torch gutters in the wind. Two men move where no army should be able to move, following a path that exists only in the memory of shepherds and goats. Below them, in the narrow pass between mountain and sea, 300 men are sleeping. They believe the walls of stone around them are still walls. They believe the only road to their deaths runs straight ahead, where they can see it coming. They are wrong. Somewhere in the dark above their heads, betrayal is already descending the mountain, quiet as smoke, patient as rot. By morning, the shape of the ancient world will have changed, not because of a battle, because of a whisper, a name traded for gold, a secret sold to the very enemy it should have destroyed. History remembers the spears. History remembers the shields locked together in the dust. It forgets, too often, the silence that made the slaughter possible. This is the story of that silence. This is the story of Ephialtes. The mountains of central Greece do not forgive. In the late summer of 480 BC, the pass at Thermopylae was a wound cut into the earth itself, a narrow gash between towering limestone cliffs on one side and the churning gray water of the Malian Gulf on the other. The Greeks called it the Hot Gates, named for the sulfurous springs that bled steam into the morning air, so that the entire pass seemed to breathe like something alive, something wounded, something waiting. It was barely wide enough for a wagon in places. That was the point. A place built by geography itself to swallow armies whole, to turn numbers into meaningless arithmetic. Here 1,000 men could hold back 100,000 if they had the will to die for every inch of stone. And the will was coming. From the east, across a bridge of boats lashed together over the Hellespont, an empire was pouring into Greece. The largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled, led by Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of Persia, a man who believed his empire so vast that rivers ran dry beneath the boots of his soldiers. Herodotus would later claim the army numbered in the millions. Modern historians are more skeptical, but even the conservative estimates describe a force of well over 100,000 men. Infantry, cavalry, archers, and the feared Immortals, an elite guard whose ranks were replenished the instant one man fell, so that their numbers never seemed to diminish, never seemed to die. Against them, a coalition of Greek city-states, fractured by centuries of rivalry, suspicious of one another, slow to unite even as the sky itself seemed to darken with Persian arrows. At the front of that fragile alliance stood a king who had sworn, by law and by blood, never to retreat. His name was Leonidas. The air in the pass smelled of salt and sulfur and horse sweat. At night, campfires threw long shadows against the cliffs, and men who had marched from 100 different cities, Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, sat shoulder to shoulder, sharpening blades that would, within days, be dulled with blood. Somewhere in the dark beyond their fires, the Persian camp stretched to the horizon, its torches so numerous that soldiers on the Greek side said it looked as though the stars themselves had fallen to the earth. Fear has a smell. The old soldiers knew it. It rode on the wind that night, mixing with wood smoke and the mineral stink of the hot springs, and every man in that narrow pass breathed it in without a word. Then everything changed. Leonidas was not born to hesitate. He was born into a system engineered, from a moment of birth, to produce men incapable of retreat, a society that had turned survival itself into a kind of heresy. In Sparta, a newborn was not simply welcomed into the world. He was inspected. Elders examined the infant for weakness, for deformity, for any flaw that might one day disgrace the line of warriors he was meant to join. The stories say that those judged unfit were left exposed on a hillside, given back to the mountain that had made them. Whether every detail of that practice is historical fact or later legend, the truth beneath it is undeniable. Sparta did not raise children. Sparta manufactured soldiers. At 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his mother's house and delivered into the agoge, a training system so brutal that the word itself became a byword for discipline stripped of mercy. He slept without a real bed, wove his own rough mat of reeds from the riverbank, and was fed so little that hunger became a permanent companion, a silent voice always whispering in his stomach. Theft of food was not merely tolerated but encouraged, so long as the thief was not caught. Getting caught was the crime. Getting caught meant the whip, meant humiliation in front of the boys who would one day stand beside him in a shield wall, or fail to. Pain, in Sparta, was curriculum. Leonidas grew inside that machine the same as every Spartan boy of noble blood, though he was never meant to be king. He was the third son of Anaxandridas II, born into a line of succession that should have passed him by entirely. His half-brother Cleomenes held the throne. Another brother, Dorius, proud and ambitious, expected to inherit power and instead sailed away in bitterness when the crown eluded him, dying in a failed colonial venture far from Sparta's soil. Fate, or something colder than fate, kept removing the men who stood between Leonidas and the throne. By the time he took the crown, sometime around 490 BC, Leonidas was already a product of everything Sparta valued and everything it refused to show the world. A man trained since childhood to consider his own death a debt owed to the state, payable on demand. He did not know, not yet, when that debt would come due. But Sparta had a saying, passed from father to son like a blade handed down through generations. Come back with your shield, or on it. Leonidas would choose the second. To understand what happened at Thermopylae, one must first understand the machine that made it inevitable. A machine built not of bronze and iron, but of law, fear, and a philosophy of life so extreme that it produced, in the end, its own executioner. Spartan society divided the world into 3 brutal categories. At the top, the Spartiates, full citizens, warriors by birthright, forbidden from any trade but war. Beneath them, the Perioikoi, free but without political voice, craftsmen and traders who kept the machinery of the state running while Spartiates trained for battle from dawn until the light failed. And at the very bottom, vastly outnumbering both, the Helots. The Helots were not slaves in the ordinary sense. They were a conquered people, the descendants of Messenians crushed generations earlier, bound to the land they had once owned, forced to farm it from masters who had taken everything from them but their lives. Every year, by ancient custom, the Ephors of Sparta formally declared war upon the Helots, a ritual declaration that allowed any Spartan to kill any Helot without consequence, without trial, without the stain of murder touching his hands. This was not incidental cruelty. It was policy. It was architecture. A state that lived in permanent fear of the people it had conquered built an entire military culture around that fear, training its citizens from childhood not merely to fight foreign enemies, but to be ready always for the uprising it dreaded from within its own fields. Out of that fear came discipline. Out of that discipline came an army whose reputation alone could sometimes end a battle before it began. Spartan hoplites did not fight as individuals. They fought as a single organism, the phalanx, a wall of overlapping shields and leveled spears, each man protecting not only himself, but the exposed side of the soldier beside him. To break formation was to kill your brother as surely as any enemy blade. Cowardice was not merely shameful in Sparta. It was a kind of social death. Men who fled battle, the Trezantes, the Tremblers, were stripped of citizenship, forbidden to marry, mocked openly in the street, made to wear patched cloaks as a permanent mark of disgrace. Some, it is said, took their own lives rather than live inside that shame. This was the machine that produced the 300. But the machine was never meant to fight alone. Sparta's power rested on alliance as much as discipline. a fragile network of city-states bound together by treaty, pride, and mutual suspicion, known to history as the Hellenic League. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and dozens of smaller polis, each with its own gods, its own grudges, its own reasons to distrust the others, found themselves forced into unity by a single, overwhelming threat descending from the east. Xerxes did not merely want to conquer Greece. He wanted to erase the memory of his father's humiliation. A decade earlier, at Marathon, a Persian invasion force had been broken by a smaller Athenian army in a battle that should never have been won. The defeat haunted the Persian court like an old wound that would not close. Xerxes inherited that wound along with his throne, and he built, over 4 years, an invasion so vast it required a canal cut through solid rock at Mount Athos, so his fleet would not have to risk the deadly waters where his father's ships had once been destroyed by storm. Rivers, the ancient sources claim, ran dry beneath the marching feet of his army. Whole forests were felled to bridge the Hellespont. This was not war. This was theater, engineered on a scale meant to make resistance look insane. And into that theater walked 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies, prepared to make their stand in a gap between the mountains barely wide enough to swing a sword. The Persian army arrived at Thermopylae like weather, an event more than an army, a darkening on the horizon that took days to fully reveal itself. Xerxes, confident and faintly amused by the arrogance of the force blocking his path, sent a mounted scout ahead to observe the Greek position. The scout returned with a report the King of Kings found difficult to believe. The Spartans, rather than preparing frantically for the coming slaughter, were exercising bare-chested outside their fortifications, combing out their long hair with the calm, unhurried ritual of men preparing not for battle, but for a funeral rite of their own choosing. To the Persians, it looked like madness. To the Spartans, it was tradition. A warrior groomed himself before death the same way he groomed himself before a festival, because in the Spartan mind, a glorious death was not a tragedy to be mourned. It was the fulfillment of a purpose written into him since birth. For 4 days, Xerxes waited, sending envoys demanding the Greeks lay down their arms. The answer that came back from Leonidas has echoed through 25 centuries. Molenleb. Come and take them. On the 5th day, the King of Kings ran out of patience. The first Persian assault came in waves. First the Medes, then the feared Immortals themselves, hurled against a wall of bronze shields in a space too narrow for their superior numbers to matter. Spartan spears, longer and better balanced than anything the Persian infantry carried, tore through the front ranks before Persian short swords could ever close the distance. Behind the front line, the phalanx rotated in disciplined intervals, tired men falling back, fresh men stepping forward, so that the wall of death facing the Persian army never weakened, never tired, never once showed the enemy an opening. Xerxes is said to have leapt from his throne 3 times that day, watching his finest soldiers broken against a line that would not move. But that was not the worst part. The worst part had not yet climbed the mountain. For 2 days, the impossible held. The pass at Thermopylae had become a slaughterhouse built entirely from geography and discipline, a place where Persian numbers meant nothing because the mountain itself refused to let those numbers matter. Bodies piled against the narrow walls in numbers that, by the 2nd day, forced Persian soldiers to physically clamber over their own dead in order to reach the Spartan spears waiting for them. Xerxes, humiliated in front of his own court, is said to have wept, not from grief, but from a rage so total it curdled into something closer to disbelief. An empire that had never known defeat on this scale was being held at bay by a force smaller than a single division of his own army, in a pass so narrow that his cavalry, his archers, the full terrible weight of Persian military might, simply could not be brought to bear. Somewhere in the Persian camp, among soldiers who had marched from a dozen conquered nations, whispers began to circulate about the surrounding terrain, about paths, about locals who knew this land better than any map the royal cartographers carried, about a way, perhaps, around the wall of shields rather than through it. Those whispers found their way, eventually to a man named Ephialtes. History remembers little of him before this moment, and that absence is its own kind of horror. He was a local man from the region of Malice, a Greek among Greeks, born beneath the same sky as the men bleeding to death in the pass below. Herodotus, writing within living memory of the event, offers a motive so simple it is almost unbearable: greed. Ephialtes wanted reward, and he believed, correctly, that Xerxes would pay handsomely for the one piece of information the Persian king needed most. He knew the go path. The Anapeia trail wound up through the mountains behind Thermopylae, a route used for generations by local shepherds moving their flocks between pastures, invisible to any army approaching from the coastal road. Leonidas had known of its existence. He had stationed a force of Phocian soldiers on the high ground specifically to guard it. But knowing a weakness exists and closing it completely are not the same thing. And in the space between those two truths, Ephialtes walked into the Persian camp and offered to sell the gap. There is no record of hesitation, no dramatic confession, no crisis of conscience preserved in the ancient sources. He simply came forward, named his price, and led a division of Xerxes' immortals up into the dark. Somewhere on that mountain, in the hours before dawn, an ordinary man decided that his neighbors' lives, his king's lives, the lives of strangers dying honorably a few hundred feet below him, were worth less than gold. The climb took most of the night. Immortals, chosen precisely because they did not tire, moved in silence along a path barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, guided by a traitor who knew every turn, every loose stone that might betray their approach with sound. Oak forest gave way to bare rock as the trail climbed higher, the air growing colder, thinner, the only sound the whisper of sandals on stone and the occasional clatter quickly stifled. At the summit, where the path leveled before descending toward the Greek rear, a garrison of Phocian soldiers had made their camp. The men Leonidas had trusted to guard exactly this approach. They heard the Persians before they saw them, the rustle of oak leaves underfoot, the sudden silence of birds. By the time they scrambled for their weapons, arrows were already falling. The Phocians retreated to higher ground, expecting the full weight of the assault to fall on them. It never came. The Immortals had no interest in a skirmish with a few hundred Phocian soldiers. Their purpose was the path itself, not the men guarding it, and they simply continued past, descending toward the rear of the Greek position at Thermopylae, leaving the Phocians alive, confused, and utterly failed in the one task given to them. By the time word reached Leonidas that the path had been found, that Persian soldiers were already descending behind his lines, the mathematics of the battle had changed completely. The wall of stone that had made 300 men equal to 100,000 no longer existed. The hot gates were about to open from both directions at once. The empire survived that morning. So did the King of Kings. What did not survive was the illusion that geography alone could save Greece. And what began, in that instant, was the slow, agonizing understanding among the Greek commanders that some among them would have to die so that others could carry a warning south. Leonidas held a council in the dark. What was said in that council, no source records with certainty, but the outcome speaks for itself. Most of the allied contingents were dismissed, ordered to retreat south, and preserve their strength for battles yet to come. The Spartans stayed. So did a contingent of Thespians, who refused to abandon men who had chosen to die, and a force of Thebans whose loyalty history has long debated. Some accounts suggest they were held back against their will, hostages to Spartan suspicion of Theban sympathy for Persia. Whatever the truth, when dawn broke fully over Thermopylae, the men who remained understood precisely what waited for them. Not victory, not even survival, only the chance to make the price of their deaths as unbearable as possible for the empire that would soon walk over their bodies. They did not run. The final battle at Thermopylae bears almost no resemblance to what came before it. This was not disciplined defense within a narrow pass. This was annihilation, chosen freely, executed with a kind of grim, terrible artistry. Leonidas led his remaining men out beyond the narrow wall they had defended for days, into the wider part of the pass, and threw them at the advancing Persian line in what ancient sources describe as something closer to a controlled slaughter than a battle. Spears broke first, snapped against Persian shields and armor until nothing remained but splintered wood. Then swords. Then, when swords shattered or were lost, bare hands, teeth, whatever remained of a body still capable of resisting. Leonidas fell somewhere in the chaos, and around his body the fighting reached its most savage pitch. The surviving Spartans forming a final desperate ring, fighting not to win, because winning was no longer possible, but to keep the Persians from claiming the king's corpse. Herodotus records that his body was fought over 4 times before the Persians finally secured it. Xerxes, when the battle ended, ordered something almost without precedent in the treatment of a defeated enemy commander. He had Leonidas's head cut from his body and mounted on a stake. It was an act of rage disguised as triumph, the gesture of a king who understood, even in victory, that he had been humiliated by men he had expected to sweep aside in an afternoon. The last of the Spartans and Thespians died where they stood, encircled, buried finally beneath a storm of Persian arrows when hand-to-hand fighting proved too costly even for an army that could afford to lose thousands. By the time the sun reached its height, the pass at Thermopylae belonged entirely to Persia. 300 Spartans, perhaps 700 Thespians, had held the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled for the better part of 3 days. In the end, it was not Persian steel that broke them. It was silence sold in the dark. Word of Thermopylae reached the rest of Greece not as a defeat, but as something stranger, a warning wrapped inside a legend. The pass had fallen. Xerxes marched south, burning Athens to ash within weeks, the city's temples reduced to blackened stone. By every conventional measure, Ephialtes' betrayal had worked precisely as intended. The Persian war machine, briefly humiliated, resumed its advance. And yet something had shifted that could not be undone by fire or conquest. The story of the 300, the sacrifice made not out of certainty of victory, but out of pure, uncompromising duty, spread through the Greek world faster than the Persian army could march. It became the argument that finally silenced the endless quarreling among the city-states. If 300 Spartans could hold the world's greatest army for 3 days, what could the united strength of all Greece accomplish? Within a year, the fleets of Athens and her allies crushed the Persian navy at Salamis. Within 2, the Persian army itself was broken at Plataea, on land not far from where Leonidas had fallen. The invasion that Ephialtes' betrayal had made possible was, ultimately, defeated anyway, but only because Thermopylae had bought Greece something more valuable than a delayed battle. It had bought belief. For Ephialtes, there was no glorious aftermath. There was only exile and shame, and the particular loneliness of a man whose name would be spoken forever as a curse rather than remembered as a person. He fled to Thessaly after the Persian withdrawal, hunted by a Greek world that had placed a substantial bounty on his head, his crime too significant, too symbolic, to ever be forgiven or forgotten. He was killed years later, not by a soldier's blade in open battle, but in what sources describe as a private dispute by a man named Athenidas over a matter entirely unrelated to Thermopylae. History does not record whether Athenidas knew, in that moment, that he was ending the life of the man who had sold 300 lives for gold. The Spartans, in any case, rewarded him anyway, not for justice concerning Thermopylae specifically, but simply grateful that the traitor was finally dead by whatever hand had managed it. There was no trial, no public reckoning, no moment where Ephialtes stood before the families of the men his silence had killed and offered an explanation for what he had done. He simply vanished from the record, the way rot vanishes once the wood beneath it finally collapses, not resolved, only removed. What remained was the mountain path itself, the Anapaea trail, still climbing through oak forest and bare stone exactly as it had 2,500 years earlier. Shepherds still walked it, generation after generation, most of them entirely unaware that the loose stones beneath their feet had once carried the footsteps of an empire's revenge, guided by a countryman who had traded silence for coin and, in doing so, guaranteed that his name would outlive every soldier who died because of it. Not in honor, but in infamy. At the site of the battle itself, later generations raised a monument, an epitaph carved for the Spartan dead that has echoed across every century since. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. No monument was ever built for Ephialtes. His memory required no stone. His name became the stone, a word in the Greek language that, for a time, meant simply nightmare before it settled into something even more permanent. A synonym for traitor. A warning passed down not through monuments, but through the simple, brutal fact that some betrayals are remembered longer than the empires they served. Stand today at the hot gates, and the sea has retreated so far from the ancient shoreline that the original battlefield now lies more than a mile inland, buried under centuries of silt carried down from the mountains. The narrow pass that once forced an empire to bleed for every step no longer exists in the shape that made it deadly. Geography itself, given enough time, forgets. But somewhere above those changed cliffs, the goat path still climbs through oak and stone, indifferent to the weight of what once moved along it in the dark. Every empire believes its walls are enough. Every civilization, standing at its own narrow pass, convinces itself that the geography of its advantage, its wealth, its army, its walls, its certainty, will hold against anything the world can send against it. Thermopylae teaches a colder lesson. It was never the size of the Persian army that broke Greece's first line of defense. It was one man, unseen, unremarkable, walking a path that already existed, waiting only for someone willing to sell it. Betrayal rarely announces itself with drums or banners. It comes quietly, in the space between what a system trusts and what a single human being is willing to do for a price. Every wall has a goat path somewhere in the dark. The only question history keeps asking, without ever fully answering, is who will be standing at the bottom of it when someone finally decides to sell the way through. The empire survived. The man did not, and the mountain, indifferent to both, is still there.